Добрий вечір, дорогі друзі. Я так вважаю, що українські реалії потребують обговорення на українській мові. Российские академические реальности требуют обсуждения, возможно, на русском языке, and the realities of Anglo-American academic scene require a discussion in English. Since most of the things that I have to say will address in many ways my experience of working for 22 years in the Anglo-American setting, an Anglo-American academy that was both had to do with private institutions and also with the public institutions, it would simply be, I think, more appropriate for us to address each other in English. This said, of course, the conversation that will happen afterwards can happen in any language that you prefer. This setting reminds me of the catacomb church. And it seems to me that there is a sense in which theology in Ukraine still leads a catacomb existence. So the plan today is to bring us out of the catacombs into the light of the day. And I think the people here present, the leadership here present, are precisely the people who will in fact make this possible. When I say catacomb existence, of course, I principally mean secular institutions in which to this day we're really not quite accepted at the table appropriately. I personally do not apologize for teaching theology before anybody. I think theology does a lot of good to any institution of higher learning and lower learning for that matter. And what I will present today is a very unapologetic apologetics precisely regarding this very matter. This lecture is a modest contribution to the centuries-long discussion concerning the place of theology in the university. In past decades, this discussion has acquired a sharper focus as private Christian universities in the United States have striven to regain a greater sense of mission and identity. And speaking from my own experience at my own institution, which is the University of St. Thomas, which is a mid-size Catholic university, the question of what it means for the institution to be Christian, what it means for the institution to be Catholic, is a matter of a constant public discussion. It's a discussion in our courses, it's a discussion between the faculty and the administration, it's a discussion essentially that takes place also between the university and the community, larger community that it serves. And the discussion takes a variety of angles and a variety of topics and points of view. Does Catholicity mean universality? Does Catholicity simply mean inclusivity and whatever? Does Catholicity associate itself with a very particular conception and understanding what it means to be a Catholic in a contemporary world? Does it associate itself with a very conservative, for example, Christ against culture line about the future of education? To what extent does Catholic education also embrace non-Catholic and non-Christian forms of education? So all of these questions are perpetually contested concepts. So what we shouldn't expect from this lecture is we shouldn't expect a practical resolution of the questions, but I think some conceptual resolution I would like to give. So I think I would want to give you a certain moment of psychological closure vis-a-vis certain things that I will be talking about. So please allow me to indulge your spiritual senses with this image. I stumbled upon this particular fresco several years ago as I was wandering through the streets of Florence. This image graces the Spanish chapel of the Dominican monastery attached to the church of Santa Maria Novella. And it's off the beaten path. So many tourists actually fail to notice it. And in Florence, because Florence is so obviously beautiful, I'm actually interested in non-obvious beauties of Florence. I asked the mayor of Florence actually to give us a copy of this particular image so that we could actually put it on the wall in our department. And I received a note that the permission to do so will be arriving in 3 years. So you can see that, in fact, there could be a bureaucracy that is even worse than our Ukrainian bureaucracy, and that's the Italian one. Isn't that reassuring? I think it is. So the fresco is made by 14th century Italian master Andrew the Florentine. The fresco is called The Triumph of St. Thomas Aquinas and is dated to 1365-1367. The artist depicted Aquinas sitting in the center, as you can see, with the Bible open to verses from the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, verses 7 and 8. I could reproduce it in glorious Latin. Some of it, I suppose, would not be lost on this audience, so I might as well. Aptavi et datus est mihi sensus, et invocavi et venit in me spiritus sapientiae, and preposui illum regnis et sedibus. And this is in the New Revised Standard Version. I prayed, and understanding was given to me. I called on God, and the spirit of wisdom came to me, and I preferred wisdom to scepters and thrones. End of quotation. Whenever we are going to debate the question of the next greatest motto of my own university, I'm going to propose this as our next sort of truth in advertising slogan as to what we're after. Aquinas is flanked by 10 biblical figures, and you can see those figures marked to the left and to the right. It is a kind of an iconostasis, if you will. And the biblical figures are Job, who is seen as a prophetic figure, David, Paul, Mark, Matthew, John, Luke, Moses, Isaiah, and Solomon. An interesting assortment of characters. Above Aquinas hovers 7 angelic figures personifying 7 cardinal virtues. The natural virtues of temperance, prudence, justice, and fortitude, and the which are appropriately placed below the theological virtues. And you can see the theological virtues up there of faith, hope, and charity. At the feet of Aquinas lie heretics, whose identities are not altogether clear. Anonymous heretics, I suppose. Arius, Nestorius, and Averroes, Ibn Rushd as it were, are the most likely candidates. In the lower row, the 14 seated female figures personify the 7 sacred sciences and the 7 liberal arts. Each science is accompanied by its own authoritative exponent. So you can see, essentially, I'm not going to delve into it in greater detail, but essentially you see sciences in that second from below, second from the bottom row, and then subsequently the representative of each science. Now, at this point in medieval history, Thomism had not yet acquired the status of a universal theological paradigm. And so I imagine that the 14th century Franciscan author would have actually placed Bonaventure, or perhaps even Scotus, in Aquinas' place. So historically, the triumph of Aquinas could be regarded as a fine piece of Dominican advertising material from the late Middle Ages. So this is Dominican promotional material, promotional flyer, shall we say. So I'm sharing this image with you with a view of generating a certain amount of cognitive dissonance, a kind of a cognitive restlessness. The triumph of Thomas Aquinas seems completely out of place in the present institutions of higher learning, be it in the United States or in Europe or in Eastern Europe. The fresco reflects a distinctly pre-modern understanding of the place of the sacred sciences in the university. Presently, the narrative of triumph has given way. The narrative of triumph has given way to the narrative of defeat. The pre-modern Christian subordination of pagan wisdom has turned into a modern retreat before secularism. The hymn of victory has become a chant of lament. The queen of sciences, and this is how theology was regarded in the Middle Ages, has been reduced to a beggar picking up the crumbs that fall from the table of other university disciplines. Now, in this lecture, I would like to steer clear of both pre-modern triumphalism and modern or present-day defeatism. And in fact, a defeatist position, I think, is rhetorically I find rhetorically very problematic. The minute you cry defeat, there is always a danger that people will actually believe you, and that would be a problem. So in this lecture, I would like to steer clear of both pre-modern triumphalism and modern defeatism, and instead I will concentrate on the following three issues. In the first part, I will sketch out the present intellectual climate in the Western university. In the second part, I will argue for theology's interdependent relationship with other knowledge domains. And then finally, during an informal discussion following my lecture, I will offer a number of recommendations for integrating theological inquiry in the university life in Ukraine. But again, I hope that that third part would precisely take a form of a conversation. One of the reasons why people consistently keep inviting me is because I usually give short lectures. So that is the distinct virtue of what I do. The rest is questionable. So postmodern possibilities. Any characterization of postmodernity is bound to provoke more questions than could be reasonably addressed in this talk. Different intellectual trajectories of the Enlightenment were either continued or reconsidered by the postmodern thinkers. At the risk of tremendous oversimplification, I will concentrate on a reconsideration rather than continuity. So the Enlightenment was characterized by an increased assurance in the powers of natural reason. The postmodern condition, in contrast, has been described as the cult of uncertainty. And here is a quotation from JP2, as he is affectionately known in the Catholic circles. So this is John Paul II speaking, and I quote, "A legitimate plurality of positions has yielded to an undifferentiated pluralism in the condition of postmodernity, based upon the assumption that all positions somehow are equally valid, which is one of today's most widespread symptoms of the lack of confidence in truth." So if all positions are equally valid, then no one position has any kind of claim on truth. Try that in your mathematics or physics courses, and we will see how far you can go. Now, of course, it's much more complex than in the case of humanities, but it certainly is still the case that there needs to be some kind of adjudication between different truth claims. And divorced from faith, reason has a tendency to focus on itself and to lose its grip on reality. In the West, at least, we often find the young minds gravitating towards the extremes of relativism on the one hand and dogmatism, and we try to cure them of those intellectual vices. So, for example, I consistently find my Catholic seminarians being overly dogmatic and sort of clinging to authority, particularly the authority of the papal office. And I also find my more secular students basically believing that religion is a kind of a free-for-all endeavor. Everything counts. It's all about just feeling. It's just sharing your emotions. And there is, again, no need to lay any kind of claim on reality. So how do you adjudicate then between extreme dogmatism on the one hand and also extreme skepticism vis-a-vis truth on the other hand? That's one kind of question that one could pursue. The Enlightenment's insistence on the autonomy of reason led to a gradual emancipation of the sciences from the pre-modern theistic framework. So postmodernity, in contrast, takes rationality to be culturally, traditionally, and historically conditioned, and thereby opening a possibility for the theological reappropriation of rationality. So this idea that reason doesn't float in some sort of ahistorical vacuum. This idea that somehow reasoning happens in history, that reasoning is traditioned in certain remarkable ways, that there is always a history to reason, I think that idea helps tremendously Christianity that fundamentally is based on the historically grounded revelation. So revelation itself, of course, as a reality, the ultimate source of which is God, but which also finds its expression in nature and in history. I think there, again, Christianity has much to offer precisely, or rather postmodernity has much to offer, or opens up a certain interesting space for Christianity. Enlightenment empiricism is often mistakenly identified with scientism, and that is an outlook that privileges natural scientific knowledge and marginalizes all other forms of knowledge. So if you ask a general member of the public, whenever we talk natural science, we always talk something that has to do with truth and has to do with reality. Whenever we talk ethics or whenever we talk religion, we're talking about things that somehow are unrelated to truth and reality. Why? Well, because what's assumed is that what counts as knowledge has to be taken, has to be borrowed from natural sciences. Now, I'm no enemy of natural sciences. In fact, I suppose I'm a card-carrying natural scientist myself because that's where I started. But that is not to say, however, that therefore a natural scientific epistemological paradigm, and particularly the paradigm that invests so much in the empirical, that paradigm should dominate the mental horizon of the contemporary academy. In its extreme form, scientism is a claim that the natural sciences provide the only valid form of knowledge. Scientism discriminates against any discipline that doesn't satisfy the empiricist paradigm, including philosophy and theology. At best, religious discourse might be useful as a source of imaginative stories and as an item of cultural history, according to this paradigm. But such a discourse cannot pass for knowledge. So by questioning the epistemological imperialism of scientism, postmodernity has created some unexpected opportunities for theology. Our discipline and humanities more generally may develop and perfect their own methods without having to satisfy the empirical paradigm. At the same time, theology should not be differentiated too sharply from other knowledge domains, with the unfortunate result that our discipline becomes a language game with the rules applicable only within its own boundaries. To anticipate the main argument of this lecture, the lecture itself would be a case for the interdependence between theology and other knowledge domains. So that's the general claim. So what I'm saying is that the epistemological criteria that one applies to theology have to be appropriate to its object. Since the object of theology, the primary object of theology is God and all things related to God, the tools that we use to get at the understanding of the object have to be appropriate to it. Just as in the case of natural sciences, the primary object is nature. And just as in the case of history, the primary object is the past that is not accessible in the way in which nature or God are accessible. So in all of those three cases, therefore, there needs to be a distinctiveness, on certain overlap, indeed, but a distinctiveness of epistemological paradigms. Moving on to the whole issue of religion and violence in the world. The reality of terrorism and religiously fueled violence, and of course the sad situation in eastern Ukraine comes to mind because a certain perverse Christian apocalypticism, unfortunately, is behind violence even in Ukraine. It's certainly not by no means the main cause, it's by no means the only cause, but it is a factor in the kind of a unfortunate stew. So the reality of terrorism and religiously fueled violence have triggered a re-examination of the foundations of Western civilization and a renewal of public interest in the role of religion in politics. In the aftermath of the terrorist attack against the United States in 2001, the former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, remarked that when she studied politics in the 1950s, and I quote, there was a sense that certain conflicts were so complex that to bring God and religion into them was an additional complicating factor because there were so many diverse ideas. So the notion was keep religion out of politics, steer clear out of religion because this only makes the situation that is already difficult even more difficult. So a half century later, she actually came to my school to say that she needed to retract that position. She needed to change that position dramatically. She became convinced that a mature grasp of religious issues was actually indispensable for the formation of future politicians and leaders. In our world, this implied, above all, an increased knowledge of Islam and religiously sanctioned chauvinism and imperialism. And so when essentially nationalism and religion somehow latch onto each other, somehow become embroiled in sort of one equation, one problematic set of ideas, how does one disentangle them, how does one analyze them, and how does one actually approach the body politic in light of that knowledge? Religious factors frequently surfaced in present-day debates on the limits of scientific research. So think of the issues in bioethics, for example, and on social issues, from the moral logic of birth control to the definition of marriage. We have here a promising venue of cooperation between theologians, philosophers, and legal scholars. And this is true, I think, for all institutions. So, for example, in my own college, I run an interdisciplinary colloquium, and we very often would invite lawyers, and we would, theologians would comment on their writings. In fact, a year from now, we're having precisely a moral theologian discussing a book with a professor from law school. Most recently, I did a colloquium where you had a biblical scholar's material discussed by an art historian. And of course, some works would not naturally yield themselves to that kind of interdisciplinary inquiry, but it's also clear that interdisciplinary inquiry is a kind of a wave and a way of the future. And the subject matter in the case of the biblical scholars' work was actually the book of prophet Ezekiel and the related data from Assyrian and Babylonian culture dealing with kind of a similar visionary material. And so it was extremely interesting for an art historian trained in Greek vases, actually, and essentially in the art of ancient Greece to cast light on the same period, if not on the same culture, and looking at those comparative parallels. Looking now at utilitarian pressures, and I think that would apply both to the world of Eastern Europe, but it certainly does apply to the world in which education is very, very costly. One of the common objections to required theology courses in my school and in the university system in general is that our discipline has no immediate pragmatic payoff. If we take into account the rising costs of higher education, and it is very high, and it's a problem and it's a scandal, and it's something obviously that needs to be grappled with, to be dealt with somehow, and especially Catholic schools have to take the lead in that regard, that this objection simply cannot be ignored. The question needs to be confronted directly. Is theology merely a luxury that 21st century students won't be able to afford, or is it effectively something indispensable? So, and I think it's a serious challenge. I don't think that this is a challenge that you could simply sweep under the rug, as it were. So the pressures to instrumentalize education were there in the research institutions of the 19th century, but they certainly are with us today. The pressures to make education a function of certain survival skills in the labor market are today stronger than ever. And again, I think we would be very hypocritical before our students if we were not to equip them also to survive in the market. And so in other words, and here's what I'm recommending then. So given these challenges, one could make a case that theology is both an instrumental good and an intrinsic good. I mean, very often, the way in which this discussion is set is that you either argue for it to be instrumental good or for it to be an intrinsic good. So the study of theology, I would argue, is an instrumental good in as much as it makes students better thinkers, writers, and citizens. The basic grasp of fundamental theological ideas is indispensable for understanding such subjects as, for example, Renaissance art, Enlightenment political theory, history of literature, and so on. The study of theology is also an intrinsic good. So if all of that were the case, I think you could simply acquiesce in the study of religion as a subject, as human experience. But then why would you need theology? So it is, on the one hand, an instrumental good, but I would also argue that it is also an intrinsic good. And this is a stronger claim, obviously. And it's an intrinsic good in as much as it opens the young minds to the reality of God and positions all learning within the horizon of the transcendent. Now, what you will find then in the second part of my presentation today is really a kind of an extended argument for this particular thesis, for the thesis that theology is also an intrinsic good. A worldview informed by theology, when properly practiced and understood, could offer liberation from different forms of idolatry, such as consumerism, materialism, dogmatism, and reductionism. Furthermore, as my friend Robert Louis Wilkin observed, and I quote, "If reasoning about the soul and God, and hence about what it means to be human, is excluded from the university, the intellectual enterprise makes itself captive of the present, welcoming the past only on our own terms." So the notion here is that if you remove theology from the equation, you also shorten historical memory, because you're not making any kind of argument for why history matters. You're simply saying, well, the past is kind of there as a curiosity. But theology actually makes the past something that is fraught with value. And that is, therefore, a very different type of claim. To exclude the teaching of the Catholic theological tradition from the university is effectively to run the risk of limiting our students' intellectual horizon by the ideas and concerns prevalent in our own time. I have no problem with our own time, love our own time actually, but I think it's remarkably short-sighted to effectively have a hermeneutical horizon that is limited to one generation or several generations. I mean, to some extent, the neo-patristic revival in Orthodox theology and in Catholic theology, its fundamental intention was to say that the hermeneutical horizon is much larger than the post-Enlightenment theological enterprise, that it involves pre-modern in some very fundamental ways. So it wasn't therefore simply a kind of an excavation of the ancient sources. It was actually inquiring into those sources as contemporary theological, as our theological contemporaries. So moving on to the next point, which is the new atheism. One recent attack on the intellectual respectability of theology comes from the so-called New Atheism movement, which includes some well-known biologists, philosophers, and public intellectuals. The four acknowledged leaders of the movement are Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and also the late Christopher Hitchens, who died in 2011. Now you can see here, of course, a bus. This is a bus that at some point you actually had running down the streets of England. And notice it says there's probably no God. And you might be wondering why probably is in that equation. You see, every single advertisement that you have in Great Britain, you have to pass through a certain approval board. And the approval board asks the following question. It asks fundamental questions about the truth in advertising. And so they ask the question, well, what's the evidence for the claim that there is no God? Because they couldn't deliver on the evidence of the claim that there is no God, they had to insert, and this is the advertising, and of course weakening the thesis. And then subsequently something shallow that's added, and that is now stop worrying and enjoy your life. So this is, it sort of reminds me of Boccaccio's Decameron, actually. Something very similar, kind of a message that was rather similar to that. So with the titles such as Dawkins's The God Delusion, or Harris's The End of Faith, and Hitchens's God is Not Great, and the subtitle is How Religion Poisons Everything, the new atheists presented themselves as culture warriors, as new evangelists of social Darwinism. The new atheists have recycled old Enlightenment arguments against religion and added some new ones for good measure. When the arguments alone prove weak, rhetoric and advertisement campaigns are used as compensation. So the overall purpose of such campaigns is to sensationalize the perceived conflict between science and religion. Now consider the following self-congratulatory declaration of Daniel Dennett, and I quote, "At least in the minds of academics, science has won and religion has lost. And Darwin's idea has banished the book of Genesis to the limbo of quaint, that's to say archaic, mythology." Unquote. In Dennett's scenario, cosmological naturalism and neo-Darwinism will soon replace theology and religion in the university curriculum. Now notice that the same kind of rhetoric you found, for example, within the positivist circles of late 19th century and early 20th century. So in many ways the arguments are not new. What's new is the flair and the rhetorical power and the emotional force with which they're presented. And of course, something curious happened to me actually when I was teaching for a semester at Harvard. This was in 2007. And that is Christopher Hitchens actually came to town. And the interest in Hitchens was with MIT, and that's Massachusetts Institute of Technology, because there, many of my former colleagues, physicists, thought that actually there might be something to the claim that there is a God. Whereas with my own colleagues at Harvard Divinity School, most of whom believed that God was this extraordinary cultural construct, they thought that there was no argument with Hitchens. So it was a rather strange situation, where you had theologians basically completely conceding the ground and saying there's simply nothing to be argued about. And then actually physicists saying, well, wait a minute, there's something really wrong here. And I actually find this dynamic very surprising, where effectively, particularly British biologists come with this very heavy dose, sort of immunized against religion forever, and use biology effectively as a surrogate religion. Almost like 20th century Marxists did, and saw what they had to offer as an alternative to religion. Whereas, for example, in the cosmology departments, in mathematics, in theoretical physics, the understanding is far more complex, and it's actually not quite a fait accompli. So what's interesting about this is the investigation of the politics of this discourse. In addition to the truth claims that are being made, it's very clear that the politics of discourse influences the way in which people think about these matters. Now, in our own time, the new atheists parade cosmology and evolutionary biology as the main intellectual substitutes, as I mentioned, for theology. Richard Dawkins is, for example, ready to supply the details. The universe, says Dawkins, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. If you think of Sartre and Camus, you think he's really overdosed on them when he was in college. So my point here is you're really confronted with a worldview here. You're not confronted with a cool-headed vision of how the things are. You're really confronted here with an alternative mythology. And in many ways, therefore, it has to be deconstructed as such. So again, postmodernity, therefore, is not theology's simply primary enemy. I did say that when it comes to the question of truth, postmodernity has relatively little to offer, because effectively the whole notion of the possibility of truth is profoundly questioned. But postmodernity also opens up some remarkable possibilities in this regard. So again, this is certainly a committed worldview. It's a surrogate theology. It's also actually a form, it clearly also offers a certain vision of human nature. So in Dawkins's picture, life springs from non-life, freedom from chance, and love becomes a convoluted form of self-preservation. And so the things that humans value most, life, freedom, morality, beauty, and love, are dismissed as epiphenomena which have no place in the fundamental structure of being. Dawkins's outlook is pseudo-theology. It is an inversion of the Christian claim that the universe is a free gift of the God of infinite love. And my friend David Bentley Hart, of course, has argued with equal rhetorical force against essentially people like Dawkins. Unexpected help from scientists and philosophers. Now, happily, the new atheists have not remained unanswered. Numerous Christian intellectuals, including our own colleagues, and I'm referring actually to colleagues in my department, have responded to their challenge in various ways. In addition, new developments in the natural sciences have opened up new unexpected opportunities for dialogue between science and theology. And I will highlight just 3 developments in this regard. First, most contemporary cosmologists agree that the universe had a beginning. In the absence of something like a theistic doctrine of creation, one is left with the fundamental conundrum. How could something come from nothing? As William Steger and others have argued at length, the claim that the world was created by a personal God provides the most rationally satisfying explanation. The natural laws explain how the universe came to be, while divine intentions explain why the universe exists at all. So the how questions are to be left to scientists and engineers. The why questions are those that are pursued in the domain of philosophy and theology. Now, the second discovery is in the field of modern theories of evolution. New computer models and empirical data suggest that the cooperation of individuals and even the sacrifice of individuals may in fact advance evolutionary development. The notion that cooperation is essential for evolution challenges the neo-Darwinian tenet that nature is, I quote, red in tooth and claw, and that the survival of the fittest means primarily the extinction of the unfit. Contemporary theologians, for example, my friend from Cambridge, Sarah Coakley, have noted that the evolution of cooperation provides grounds for the idea of sacrificial love in Christian theology. So that's remarkably, I mean, these are some new and interesting studies that are emerging here, based actually on mathematical models, on game theory, and particularly on the whole question of how significant cooperation is for evolution. Now, I mean, this is sort of intuitively true. We know that without cooperation, we really can't do anything. I mean, without networking, you can't really do anything in the world in general. Therefore, what's remarkable here is the extent to which this also applies mutatis mutandis to evolution. The third discovery of modern natural science has to do with the reemergence of teleological explanations to accounts for large-scale transformations in nature. And by teleology, I mean the notion, the general point that the universe somehow is purpose-governed. So, for example, Thomas Nagel, who, by the way, is an agnostic. This is rather important. I want to emphasize the fact that this is a testimony from an agnostic. In his recent book, Mind and Cosmos, and this is Oxford 2013, argues essentially that the standard materialist account of evolutionary biology is incomplete and must be supplemented by a teleological rather than mechanistic understanding of the laws of nature. So the claim here is that the laws of nature themselves, if they are to have a history, if you can claim for them even some sense of a kind of a meta-development, then in fact the laws themselves are purpose-governed. So Christian philosophers would argue that teleological directionality cannot be explained within the naturalistic framework, since the concept of self-fulfilling purpose is question-begging. I mean, how can you possibly have a purpose to it all if there is no purpose behind the purpose? I mean, you cannot quite bring that about. So to postulate a transcendent intelligent agent, which is God, who directs the process of natural changes, is to provide a richer, more intellectually satisfying explanation. So what happens here is that theology provides an argument for the best possible explanation. And it's not your classical medieval deductive argument. You don't quite have a theorem at the end of which you have God. That'd be wonderful to have, but I don't think that's really available. But what is available, however, are various informal considerations and informal arguments, including an argument to the best explanation that actually shows it to be the case that God is a much better context for something like teleology in nature. So these are much softer claims epistemologically. These are claims that are much more tame, shall we say. They're modest epistemologically, but they are not nothing. They do amount to knowledge, and that's the general claim in this case. So in the past 40 years, theology has also received considerable intellectual help from philosophers of science and philosophers of religion. Such intellectual giants as, for example, Richard Swinburne, Eleanor Stump, William Wollstone, William Abraham, Eldon Plantinga, and Linda Zagzebski have contributed to the defense of Christian theism in ways that have transformed their field. Every May since 2009, about 100 philosophers and theologians descend together upon the University of Notre Dame in order to discuss fundamental questions in philosophy of religion. Many of the participants are committed Christian intellectuals. I took part and made presentations at several of such conferences, and actually will be there in about a month from now. And in my own university, Professor Mike Rota, whom actually several of you know through a variety of projects, effectively has conducted similar workshops in philosophy of religion, which attract an equally distinguished group of participants. We in the theology department at St. Thomas sometimes joke that actually philosophers spend more time talking about God than we theologians, while we theologians talk about just about everything else but God. And we have a kind of an army of Thomists, that's to say people specializing in Aquinas and all forms and shapes in the philosophy department. So it's rather interesting, again, to notice that the kind of social dynamic that in the past 30 or 40 years, there is a really profound shift of philosophical discourse. If in the 1970s, you would not be admitted to certain clubs, simply, at the University of Oxford if you started to talk about religion and philosophy. Richard Swinburne basically in one generation changed that. I mean, he comes, he applies probability theory that works in science to theology. Half of us thinks that's completely ridiculous. The other half of us actually think that's a very powerful apologetic tool. And he changes the field. He just, not single-handedly, but makes a very significant contribution to making philosophy of religion, again, back into the conversation. So the John Templeton Foundation is playing a key role in these new developments, funding projects in science and theology, religious ethics, and philosophy of religion. So to conclude, in the past decades, our discipline has acquired some unexpected friends among scientists, philosophers, and even politicians. At the same time, the voices of those who aim at marginalizing theology in the academic discourse remain very strong. And I know that they're also strong in this context, in Ukraine. However, our time offers remarkable opportunities. If modernity was synonymous with secularism, post-modernity could become synonymous with post-secularism. And so Christian intellectuals need to show more leadership in shaping the postmodern discourse. So just thinking of the American milieu, 30 or 40 years ago, there was less religion on campus than today. There was less religion in the classroom than today. My university, for example, offered one course in spiritual formation, which was sort of wishy-washy. You know, today, for the past 20 or more years, we've actually had 3 required theology courses. I mean, every single undergraduate, whether you be a political science undergraduate or other, has to suffer through. And some of them didn't like it, believe it or not. Or at least they begin questioning it, and then at some point, they actually think it's helpful. Would you agree? There we go. So the interdependence of theology and other knowledge domains. So this is moving to the second part. Now, how do other sciences contribute to theological inquiry? Please allow me a brief pedagogical digression. I usually begin my introductory theology course. This is, again, a course that all undergraduates have to take, by showing my students this image, okay, and asking them to identify it. Well, in this case, I haven't yet identified. I only said that this is a negative and this is the original. And usually out of 30 of them, I can bet on about 5 or 7 that will be with me and would actually know what this is. Okay? So I asked them the following question. If you found a piece of cloth like this, let's say on the basement of this building, and a knowledgeable friend told you what? That this looks like what? What is it? Okay, the Shroud of Turin, right? So this looks like a piece of linen into which Jesus reportedly, supposedly, was wrapped, okay? So I asked them, what questions would you ask? What types of tests would you perform to ascertain whether, in fact, this is a real deal or whether this is a fake, okay? And the point of this exercise is simply to show them that actually so many different fields of endeavor, many different domains of knowledge have actually to weigh in on this very question. So some of them, for example, would say, well, we need carbon dating to date the thing. And others would even know that carbon dating is either inconclusive or shows a medieval date. And of course, a medieval date for something like this would be a problem. But then you would ask a question from, for example, what are the pieces of pollen that are present, for example, in the shroud? What about the type of material that's being used? Can we use photography to try to figure out how the image got there? Can we use chemical analysis and things of that nature to actually figure out what these things are? So you have, essentially, then you have, I asked them, suppose you, how would you deal essentially with this matter? They proceed to raise questions about the shroud's age, about its possible place of origin, etc. So the whole point then of this is that several sciences have to weigh in on the question of the shroud's authenticity. Physics, chemistry, botany, criminology, photography, history, art history, and so on. So this implies that insights and findings of other disciplines might shed light upon the study of theological questions. So to be sure, there are limitations in what scientific method can positively establish in theology. So for example, the science can demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that the shroud is a fake. I think that's entirely possible. If it could be proved, for example, that the shroud post-dates the 1st century. And as we know, that matter remains controversial. And so the Catholic Church has not taken any official position on the matter of whether the shroud is a relic. So no experiment, however intricate, can establish that this is in fact Jesus' image. Hence, there are certain limits to what sciences can actually do in theology. The methods borrowed from other disciplines do not exhaust the approaches available to a biblical scholar or a theologian. A method in theology is an immensely complex business, and my department, for example, teaches a full course for majors on the subject of theological methods and resources. And many of us dislike this course so much is that we try to avoid it by all means possible. So they usually just dump it on me. So method in theology has to be adequate to the task of understanding the primary object of theological inquiry, and that is God and all things in relation to God. Apart from formal methodology, training, skills, discernment, and informal judgments all play a role in theological inquiry. So I usually joke that after theoretical physics, I decided to try something more difficult, namely theology. So my preliminary conclusion is that theology serves as a forum for the sciences, draws on the methods of the sciences, and deploys such methods as are more suitable to its subject. Now, it's clear that the arts and sciences have much to offer theology. So does theology in turn have anything to offer to the arts and sciences? So let me offer 3 considerations as to what the gifts of and I forgot to mention also that there is also now a smartphone app dealing with the Shroud of Turin. This usually has some interest for my students. I usually find my colleagues rather nonchalant about this particular point. So I understand if you are not terribly impressed with that very point. So what precisely then, what is it that theology contributes to the overall enterprise of inquiry in the university? Let me offer 3 considerations. So first, I would argue the theological presuppositions ground scientific inquiry. So for example, theoretical physics may indeed answer the question of how the world came to be and discover the laws of nature, but as we have seen, physics cannot fully answer the question why. Is there something instead of nothing? Why is there order instead of disorder? Why does a particular set of laws conducive to the eventual production of intelligent life obtain in the universe and not a different set of laws? So the sciences are ill-equipped to answer the questions about ultimate origins. So there are certain limiting questions that sciences simply cannot quite deal with. So as I mentioned earlier, the discovery in contemporary cosmology that the universe has a beginning makes the Christian doctrine of creation out of nothing an intellectually satisfying explanation. Similarly, the discovery of the anthropic principle, against this idea that the universe is conducive to the production of anthropoids, or humans, or rational beings that look like us, that the laws of nature are attuned to producing an environment that can sustain us, makes the classical teleological explanation relevant again. So second, theology completes the arts and sciences. Now, so a historian may speculate about the meaning of individual events and periods in history. But the question whether world history has an overarching purpose surpasses the limits of historical inquiry. Biology and medicine offer powerful explanations of how organisms work, what features make them survive, and what drugs may cure them. But when left to themselves, these sciences have limited resources for addressing the questions of the nature of personhood and the value of human life and the purpose of human existence. When these disciplines attempt to offer their answers to these questions, they shift into the domain of philosophy and religion. Theology, therefore, completes the sciences by addressing the questions that the sciences point to, but cannot answer. Theological inquiry connects the horizontal dimension of the sciences with the vertical dimension. Theology integrates the study of creation with the knowledge of the Creator. Theological considerations also inform our moral choices, which lie at the heart of what it means to be human. Finally, theology unifies the sciences. So consider the following illustration. Imagine that you are studying the corpus of Beethoven's symphonies. Now, you may admire the beauty of these symphonies without knowing anything about their composer. You may write a book analyzing the symphonies, their form, their style, their themes, without so much as mentioning their creator. You may also, with great profit, discuss the impact of this music upon the generations of listeners, all the while completely ignoring Beethoven. Now, such accounts would be meaningful and useful. And this is, by the way, where I'm not with the radical Orthodox who claim that essentially it's either Christ or nothing. Okay? That effectively, without Christianity, you just have nothing but nihilistic worldview. So I would claim that there is certainly a tangible meaning to the study of these materials, even without knowing anything about Beethoven. But now compare such accounts to the study that takes all of these aspects of the symphonies into account and also includes Beethoven's life and his work as a composer, that deals actually with the creator. Now, if then the question is asked, which study provides a more comprehensive and unified account, I think the answer is obvious. So, for example, to me, it's very significant to know that the man who wrote An Ode to Joy was also a man who was actually at that point going deaf and whose life was just in shambles. You know, I mean, it's really significant for me to know that, to understand what is going on in the symphony. So once Beethoven is introduced into the narrative, our understanding of his symphonies acquires an intelligible unity and fullness that it didn't quite possess before. So by analogy, knowledge of creation remains incomplete and disjointed without the knowledge of the creator. Note again that such partial knowledge is still quite valuable. So I am entirely prepared to leave a significant limited space for natural theology, okay, if you will. So again, notice that I'm not arguing that without the knowledge of God, gaining any knowledge of creation becomes an exercise in futility. So I'm not quite saying that at all. As my example with Beethoven's symphonies implies, a great deal may be known, and known truly, about the symphonies without the knowledge of their composer. But just as our knowledge of the composer's life completes and unifies our knowledge of his works, knowledge of God completes and unifies our knowledge of creation, and hence this sort of image of the tree of knowledge. Theology is what keeps various branches of knowledge together. Theology is the root and the trunk of the tree of knowledge. Without theology, the branches of knowledge are cut off from the trunk. When the branches grow on a tree with a strong root and a healthy trunk, they bear much fruit. Nobody has captured this point more eloquently than John Henry Newman. And of course, you have already, I think, perceived the kind of Newmanesque motifs in my whole lecture, indeed in its very title, The Idea of the University. And so I quote from this eponymous work. If the various branches of knowledge, which are the matter of teaching in a university, so hang together that none can be neglected without prejudice to the perfection of the rest, and if theology be a branch of knowledge, of wide reception, of philosophical structure, of unutterable importance, and of supreme influence, to what conclusion are we brought from these two premises, but this, that to withdraw theology, that is to remove, take it away, from the public schools, he really means universities, is to impair the completeness and to invalidate the trustworthiness of all that is actually taught in them, unquote. Now, what Newman said about the state of universities of his time applies, mutatis mutandis, to the universities in our own time. And so to conclude, postmodernity offers opportunities for breaking down the barriers between faith and reason erected by the Enlightenment. The Christian university must offer a forum for the mutually enriching exchange between faith and reason, a dialogue between theology and the sciences. Faith grounds, completes, and unifies the deliverances of reason, and reason, in turn, clarifies, builds up, and illuminates faith. In our time, the harmony between faith and reason can no longer be simply assumed. Rather, the relationship between faith and reason needs to be worked out and reformulated in each generation. Thank you very much.